Hello. This summer I've been taking an online course on teaching, and I recently finished up a module that was entitled Inclusive Practices and Antiracist Pedagogy. And I'm supposed to finish this module, this section, by making a video where I was asked to talk about my reactions to what I came across and what I learned. And so that's what I'm doing. And I also thought it would be interesting to put this out publicly available. If I'm going to the trouble of making this video, maybe some people would be interested in my thoughts. So I'm going to present this publicly in addition to just submitting it for the online course. So I assume they want me to be honest, and I will try to be fair. And so I'm going to present here my opinions and my reactions to this course, neither horned nor toothed, for your consideration. So to be honest, there really wasn't a lot of new information here for me. I've been surrounded by this for decades at multiple institutions. And so many of this material I've come across, and a number of these articles and videos were 5 years old or older. And so for me, there wasn't a lot of new material as we discuss anti-racist inclusive pedagogy. But there were definitely some things worth talking about. I should also point out that this module was really geared towards white faculty. A lot of the issues in it were white versus black, or white straight people and non-straight people. So a lot of it was geared sort of like towards people who look like me. And so bear that in mind as we go through. The program started off with the observation, which I think is true, which is that we white folks are uncomfortable talking about race. And I think that is largely true, especially if you're at school or at work. We often get uncomfortable talking about it. The explanation for why this was came from Robin DiAngelo, who wrote a book called White Fragility. I put an image of it up there for you, but I don't think the book deserves any more advertising. And so DiAngelo has said that we're uncomfortable talking about race because either we're afraid of being called racist, or we're uncomfortable confronting our unexamined privilege. Well, I think those observations are not necessarily wrong, but I don't think that they really get at the heart of the issue of why we're uncomfortable talking about race. I think that talking about race often means you're going to be told what's wrong with you. You're going to be told many things that are wrong with you, especially directed towards white folks. And if you object or you want to critique this assessment, that will be used as evidence that you are even worse than we thought. So this sort of disagreement with official doctrine is a sign of even deeper racial animus. And criticisms of the accepted orthodoxy are evidence that you're just being stubborn and prideful. And so you can't really push back because, as we all know, denial is the first sign of addiction, right? So if you deny being an addict, that's a sure sign that you're an addict. And so similarly here, if you deny your own racism or prejudice or privilege, or at least want to present it in a different light than it's being presented to you, then that really shows that these problems are even more deeply rooted in your psyche. And so I think that that's really why a lot of people don't like to talk about it. Disagreement is discouraged and can be used against you personally and professionally, especially at schools and universities. And so people feel like they can't express their own thoughts, and they're going to get shouted down and told they're bad people. And so I think that that's a big reason why we are uncomfortable talking about race, or at least many people are. Okay, so the course also mentioned that as you engage in this unsettling analysis of your complicity with white supremacy, remember, if it's not joyful, you're not doing it right. And that seems sort of contradictory to me. However we're approaching this, right? If we're uncovering our deep racial animus, or we're struggling with having a difficult conversation where people aren't even sure if they can express themselves, it's not really going to be all that joyful. And so maybe if it's joyful, you're not doing it right, because confronting these issues is hard, and we should have disagreement, and we should talk about these things, and that's not always going to be so easy. So the ultimate purpose of this program, right, the whole purpose of this module was, quote, it's about creating a more just and equitable society. So, okay, great. I'm guessing no one's going to object to that. But who determines how we create a more just and equitable society? Is it philosophers? Is it political scientists or historians or economists? No, not for the most part. For the most part, it's mid-level administrators at colleges and universities. And they're the ones who are going to tell us how we then create a more just and equitable society. So never mind that the history of the world for thousands of years has had plenty of people trying to create a more just and equitable society, from Moses to Confucius, from Muhammad to Nancy Pelosi, right? There's lots of people who've been describing this, and they have very different views, and they're worth considering and analyzing and studying. But we're going to get it through here in this module. Okay, so one of the things as I started looking at this material is I was reminded of the adage that he who controls the definitions wins the argument. And I see a lot of this in these discussions where people will present definitions of words. And these are often new definitions, often post hoc definitions that people create in order to advance their arguments or their narrative. We see this with various definitions of racism, with various ways that people use the word stereotype, or recently with changes in the way that people talk about violence. But here, the one that caught my eye was when we were talking about microaggressions. And you're all familiar with microaggressions, right? So microaggressions are these small aggressions, right? And they're not nice, and we should try not to engage in them. And so this has been a topic. And I noticed how this was defined in some of the materials that we were looking at in this module. So here's a quote. While microaggressions are generally discussed from the perspective of race and racism, any marginalized group in society may become targets. People of color, women, LGBT persons, those with disabilities, religious minorities, and so on. And so my reaction is only marginalized people can be the targets of microaggressions. And I thought it was interesting, this quote is trying to be more inclusive, right? Usually we only talk about race and racism, but there's these other groups, these other marginalized groups. And so it made me wonder, you know, I can't be a victim of microaggressions. Anyone can't be. People who are overweight, people who are short, people who are awkward, people who are conservative. Can't everybody be a victim of microaggressions? And if we're going to talk about them, okay, we can talk about them and how serious they are, but relatively serious they are. But you would think this would be something that everybody could face. But by virtue of defining it in this way, then we further this narrative that society exists of certain people who are oppressors and certain people who are the oppressees. And we can identify them based on whether they are marginalized or not. And therefore, we also get then those groups who we are concerned about and those other people who we're not so concerned about. But it seems to me if you're going to talk about microaggressions, everybody's subject to this. And if we want to talk about particular types directed towards certain types of people, okay. But when you define it that way, you're controlling the entire argument. And I think you're creating a narrative that I find kind of problematic. Okay. Excuse me one moment. Now, in all fairness, there was some good stuff in this module. There was some stuff I had some issues with, but there was some good stuff in here. So let me go over to one that I thought contained some useful information. Okay, so when teaching your classes and you're teaching your students, you have different types of students. So convey the same level of confidence in the abilities of all your students as you take care not to perpetuate stereotypes. Be cautious about being overprotective or unduly strict toward any group or of individual students. Be even-handed in acknowledging students' accomplishments and areas for growth. Emphasize high standards with verbal assurances that you will help them succeed and scaffold support for meeting those standards. I thought that was great. I thought that that's the sort of thing that professors should be doing, that we should be doing in our classes. And I recognize there are times that I can fail to live up to this standard, where I can look at a group of students and in my mind, create lower standards for them or be pandering towards them. And I try really hard not to do that, but I recognize once in a while I do. Or here's a group of students who, however we categorize them, right? It can be race, it can be gender, it can be orientation, it can be, are you in a fraternity or sorority? Do you play a particular sport? What do you look like? Are you on the autism spectrum, right? So there's all sorts of ways that we can look at groups of people or look at individuals who are parts of groups and change our expectations for them. And that's wrong. And so we shouldn't be pandering to people, and we shouldn't be expecting more things from certain other people. And so I thought that was good, and always a good reminder for us who are teaching. And so, yeah, that was definitely helpful information. Another area that they touched on, I wish they'd really explored this in more detail, was the perennial discussion of texts and what gets included, what's in the canon, what sort of books do you have people read in your classes. And that's a really tricky issue. And so we have here the following quote. It's a little long. Whenever possible, instructors should work to broaden readings from only presenting dominant perspectives, instead choosing content that reflects a range of races, ethnicities, gender identities, sexualities, abilities, ages, religions, etc. That said, they should also avoid including a token marginalized perspective here or there, nominally complying with the diversity requirement instead of meaningfully including and considering different perspectives. Instead, inclusive course reading should place multiple perspectives at the center and should be contextualized and integrated with nuance. Now, this last sentence I thought was good and interesting. If instructors find themselves teaching a course that focuses exclusively on dominant perspectives, for example, Western, white, heterosexual, they should strive for transparency, encouraging students to consider why that is the case and inviting critique. And you find in this quote, I think, it captures the big challenge that people face. It is certainly true that in educating students, they should be exposed to multiple perspectives. And that can include quite a number of those categories that are presented there. And I think that's good. I think it's important. But as you read through, any professor who's going to create a course has got to be looking through this and thinking, oh, how am I going to fit this all in my course? Right? I'm trying to teach this subject matter and whatever it might be, the history of Spain, and there's going to be certain important texts and figures and individuals that we need to talk about. But now I'm also supposed to bring in all these other aspects of the discussion, other perspectives on the discussion of the topic. I'm supposed to be bringing in this range of races, ethnicities, gender identities, blah, 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 blah. And not just presenting a little bit of them as a token, but bringing in a lot of discussion, in-depth discussion of how they fit into the course material. How am I going to do that? How much time do I have? What do I leave out? And so this is always the challenge that we face. And so if you got to read through this, and even if you're like, yeah, there's some important message here, but holy moly, how the heck do you do that? This is a challenge. And I love that last sentence, which says, look, if you are in an area, maybe you're teaching a intro to physics class, and it happens that the most important figures in the field who've shaped that field are maybe primarily Western, white, and heterosexual. Well, okay, then talk to your students about why that is. Explain to them why that's the case, invite them to critique it, and have a conversation about that. And so I thought that was really good. I do wish they had really explored this challenging issue more fully, but can't do everything, right? Okay. One thing that did come up in this conversation really quickly, there was an example about wanting to be more inclusive. And so there was a reference to Max Weber. And here we go. Max Weber, very important figure in Western history and religious studies and sociology, says, for example, if you're teaching about Max Weber, I want you to say to your students, I want you to be aware that although her labors go unacknowledged here, Max Weber's wife, Marianne, prepared and published these works after his death. So this is one of those places where you can insert someone who often doesn't get any proper acknowledgement. Mrs. Weber, Marianne Weber. But at the same time, I'm left wondering, does this just seem like pandering? I guess people are going to disagree on this, But when you just throw something like that, yes, Max Weber did all these really important things and shaped discourse around the world. And his wife did this. It almost sounds like we're going to include this woman because she's a woman. And is that really kind of insulting at a certain level? And so I think that's worth discussing too. When you put these things in as token remarks, are they helpful or are they insulting? That would be a great conversation to have as well. Okay. I think for me, going through this, the biggest or the most helpful thing, in addition to what we've discussed, but one of the most helpful things is when they talk about diversity of types of learners. And this module did talk about that. They have people with various academic backgrounds. You have students who learn differently, right? You've got visual learners and auditory learners. And when you have a diversity of types of students, regardless of what color and gender and they are, you have a diversity of learners, and they come from different schools that emphasize different things. They have different strengths, they have different weaknesses, and so it's important to acknowledge that and not just teach one way and to assume that, you know, I teach religious studies, everybody's familiar with the story of Adam and Eve, everyone's familiar with the story of Jesus, because many of them are, because they come from a certain background, and I have to remember that. And so there was this discussion about, remember, you have different types of learners with different types of educational backgrounds. Take that into account. What can you do to make sure that as you teach, you are helping people with various backgrounds and abilities without slowing things down, so that you don't want to teach at a certain minimum level because you'll go too slowly, but how can you make resources available to people who might need to catch up in certain areas? So I thought that was good, but needed more of that. Again, I thought that was a good topic. We need more of this. Okay, so let's move on to what people enjoy hearing about. What did I think was problematic? So here's an example of something I came across that I was not a fan of. This comes from a guy named John Greenberg. And John Greenberg teaches about race and racism. And so as he does this, this is something that he presents to students. When teaching about race and racism, I invite participants to consider the following analogy. Think of racism as a gigantic societal-sized boot. Sorry, from John Greenberg. Which groups do you think are fighting the hardest against this boot of racism, I ask them. Invariably, participants of diverse races answer that those fighting hardest to avoid being squashed by the boot are people of color. People of color. Keep in mind that I don't ask this question on day one of our study of race. Rather, participants come to this conclusion after exploring the concept of white privilege and studying the history of race and racism in the United States through multiple sources and perspectives. I hope that's true. If that's true, I continue, that the people being squashed are people of color, then who do you think is wearing the boot? The participants answer, though it often only reluctantly hits the air, white people. This is the sort of thing that I find problematic. All white people? When you're going to create this analogy, it's such a loaded analogy. So all white people are wearing the boot? And is this really what racism is like in the United States today? Racism in the United States today is really a gigantic societal-sized boot that's squashing people of color. If we're going to be talking about what was going on in the United States 75 years ago, 100, 125 years ago, even post Civil War, maybe that image, is a little bit more accurate. But if you're going to talk about people of color, right? That's everybody but the white folks, right? So Latinos and Asians and Arabs, that they're all being squashed by this gigantic boot. You're going to have to provide, some really good evidence of this. You're going to have to give me specifics of where racism is really like this boot. Now, I'm not denying that racism and racial discrimination exist in the USA today. Look at my face a little bigger and I'll say it again. I'm not denying that race and racial discrimination exist in the US today. Yes, I understand the arguments about systemic racism and privilege. However, I would challenge a narrative that says white people are squashing people of color like a gigantic boot in America today. That, when I look at the evidence, when I look at my experiences and when I look at hard data, that is not the reality that I see. Now, of course, in a module like this, I come across material like this and I am free to disagree quietly in my own mind, right? But speaking up and challenging this to say that, no, this is over the top, who wants to do that? Even if you have tenure, no one's going to do that. That's crazy. No one feels comfortable speaking up and saying, I think this is way overblown and problematic. I think this analogy is really bad. No one wants to do that. No one seems to want to talk about issues of race today, and maybe we're understanding why. So the module finished with a number of articles that we were supposed to read. And these underscored something for me that were very important. The value of diversity. No, not the color of the author or the gender of the author, but actual diversity of perspectives, right? And sometimes that's related to, of course, to ethnicity and color and gender identity. But there really wasn't a diversity of perspectives and backgrounds. I mean, the only disagreement I came across, I think, in all these articles is whether white people should be allies or co-conspirators, right? Otherwise, everything was on one side of the discussion. There really was no dialogue, no debate, no dialectic to explore. So if colleges are places where people are pursuing knowledge and truth, how have they done that over the centuries since the Enlightenment? Critical engagement with ideas. Can you imagine a discipline of science in which studies that were published were not permitted to be critiqued? That would make absolutely no sense. Can you imagine a psychology department where only Freudian perspectives are presented? Is this scholarship? Is this helpful? Is this moving the advancement of the pursuit of knowledge and truth, or standing in the way of that? So without critical feedback, your pursuit of knowledge and truth is not going to be very productive. And it was easy to see in these many articles that they were all on one side. But the other problem is when you put yourself in this echo chamber, you allow yourself to present and make arguments that are weak. And it doesn't just, it doesn't help you when you're not subject to critique. It weakens your argument. And all of us have these experiences when we're hanging around with people who think like us and we start complaining about other people. And you think about it critically, people just say some dumb over-the-top stuff, right? And you're like, but you don't really stop and say, well, now, wait a minute. But that's what we need. We need that, well, now, wait a minute. And so let me give you some examples. There was one article that we read called Be Less Racist, 12 Tips for White Dudes by a White Dude. And so I came to tip number 3, and he said, change up your liberal media diet. And I thought, oh, great, right? He's going to say, don't just read, liberal media sources, read conservative sources, read things, from a variety of perspectives. And then he wrote, the New York Times and NPR are often called liberal media, but it's important for me to recognize that they're white liberal media, which isn't really true. If I want the big picture and some of the other views, I need to look around. And then he provides a list of media authors or media outlets from minority authors. So, okay, that does present some diversity, right? But really, that's your idea of changing up your liberal media diet. Instead of saying, yeah, you should really read some Thomas Sowell, you should read some Larry Elders or Jason Riley or John McWhorter, right? There's these great authors out there presenting a different perspective. And even if you disagree with them, they're going to make you sharper thinkers by exposing yourself to their ideas. But no. And so people get away with crap. People, I see this time and time and again, reading through this stuff. They misconstrue anecdote with data, right? Bunch of stories that they present. They think is data and making an argument about the reality of the entire country. They push problematic and exaggerated narratives. There was one quote, I forget where it was from, it says, Black folks are readily risking their lives every day purely by existing. And this wasn't something that someone just randomly said in a conversation. This is what's passing for scholarship. Black folks are readily risking their lives every day purely by existing. Now, I'm aware of the statistics. I know that if you're a young Black man in America, your chances of being killed are significantly higher than any other group, right? And so that is something that we should talk about. That's something we should try to fix as a society, right? These are important things. But to then go so far as to say Black folks, right, all Black people are readily risking their lives by existing, it's just so over the top, but no one can push back. Who would ever challenge that at a gathering of faculty or in a classroom when this is presented by the professor? Here's another example going along if you're not too tired of this, we are getting close. This was a list of observations that white people should know. So number one, as white people, we are not victims of racial oppression. Probably true. Okay. There is not a statistical measure that exists by which white people are oppressed while people of color are privileged. As such, we get zero say in how people who are oppressed respond to their oppression. Right? Because people of color, and I'm not sure who all is included in that in this author's mind, but because people of color are oppressed and white people are privileged, therefore, white people get no say in how the oppressed respond to their oppression. So if they start slaughtering their oppressors, right, we can't say anything about that. You are not allowed to critique them. You can never offer a critique. I don't know what you do if you come across two members of these of one of these groups who disagree. Are you allowed to side with one or the other? I don't know. But as an ethics professor, the idea that you cannot critique people because and their actions because they are more oppressed than you, that's absurd. We could never live by a principle like that. And number three, you may have heard this. This has to do with all the rioting that's been going on. The destruction of property pales in comparison to the destruction of lives. Okay, that's true. The lives of people taken by police and consumed by our system's endless appetites for black, brown, and indigenous suffering can never be returned. Okay, so what you have here, and any good academic would recognize this, is it's a false choice, right? It's not a choice of black people dying or burning down a CVS, right? It's a false choice. And so it's a way of saying you can't critique what these people are doing because people died. This is just bad argumentation. And I bring this up to again, make this point that when you don't expose yourself to other ideas and perspectives, you end up with poor thinking. And again, here I'm picking on the people who put, this module together. This is true of all of us, right? All my conservative friends, you do the same thing, right? Stop surrounding yourself with people who just think like yourself because you end up with lousy arguments. And so, here we're talking about this module because I was asked to give my thoughts on it, and that's what I'm doing. But all of us are subject to this. Okay, so with all that out of the way, what did I learn from this course? Here's what I learned. Diversity is really important. A diversity of perspectives, right, in which people disagree and challenge one another's ideas. It's more intellectually honest. It makes us better thinkers, and it's actually more inclusive. But then again, I already knew that. Thank you.